Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Here's something strange to fall asleep thinking about. Every story worth remembering is born in suffering. Not in comfort, not in ease, but in pressure, in loss, in conflict. Life itself seems designed around it. From the moment we are born, we suffer, and still we survive. Still we search for meaning. Still we try to make sense of the pain. But what if the pain was the point? What if suffering wasn't a mistake, but a requirement? What if this strange, aching thing we call life only means something because of the wounds it leaves behind? That's the secret we're whispering tonight. If you find comfort in this kind of darkness, if this voice helps you drift into deeper thought, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We post every single day, meaning there's always something new waiting in the dark. Also, let us know in the comments what time it is where you are and what part of the world you're listening from. We always wonder who's out there, lying awake, staring into the ceiling, thinking about the same questions. So here it is. The first lesson in dark philosophy. Suffering is not an error. It's not a glitch in the design. It's the spine of the story. And the story is the only thing that matters. Arthur Schopenhauer said the world is not rational, not kind, not fair. The world is driven by a blind, ceaseless force. He called the will. It is not thoughtful, it is not moral, it simply wants. It pulls us forward endlessly without purpose. We chase love, we chase food, we chase peace, and just when we reach it, we feel the urge again. Suffering, he said, comes from this hunger. Even when it's quiet, the hunger is still there. And yet, in the middle of this bleakness, he offered a strange kind of peace. He believed that through art, through music, through contemplation, we could briefly escape the tyranny of the will. We could step outside of desire and just observe, just be. But even this glimpse of peace is tinged with sadness, because it never lasts. Nietzsche, who both admired and rejected Schopenhauer, took the idea of suffering and set it on fire. He said, "We must not escape suffering, we must embrace it. We must love our fate, amor fati, even the pain, especially the pain." His idea of eternal recurrence wasn't just a theory, it was a mirror. He asked, what if you had to live this life, again and again, exactly as it is? Every heartbreak, every failure, every sleepless night. Would you say yes? Or would you scream? Most people would scream. But Nietzsche wanted us to build a life we would embrace, even if it meant eternal repetition. He believed that suffering, when faced with strength, could forge greatness. That meaning wasn't something given to us, it was something we earned through struggle. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, said something similar. In the darkest place imaginable, he found that those who survived longest were not the strongest. They were the ones who found meaning. They gave their suffering a purpose, a reason, a story. Frankl said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." This wasn't optimism, it was survival. He believed that even in horror, the human mind could create light, not joy, not escape, but meaning, something to hold on to, something to live for. Suffering, in his eyes, was not the end. It was the beginning. The Greeks knew this too. Their tragedies were not tales of triumph, but warnings, lessons, mirrors. Oedipus blinds himself when the truth becomes unbearable. Antigone is buried alive for honouring her brother. These stories are full of death, madness, betrayal, but also of dignity. There is a nobility in facing one's fate, even when it cannot be changed, even when it destroys. Tragedy reveals the soul. It shows who a person really is, once all comforts are stripped away. That's why we remember it, that's why it matters. But today, suffering is seen as a flaw, a problem to be fixed. We distract ourselves, medicate ourselves, entertain ourselves into numbness. But the pain returns, it always does. And when it does, we panic. We think something's gone wrong. But maybe pain isn't a signal of error. Maybe it's a signal of depth. The Japanese have a concept called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, they highlight them. The damage becomes the beauty. The break becomes the story. Maybe we are the same. Maybe our pain is the gold. Carl Jung said that true transformation only happens when we confront the shadow, the part of ourselves we fear, the pain we avoid. He didn't believe in avoiding suffering. He believed in integrating it, living with it, becoming whole through it, not healed, not fixed, but complete. And in that completeness, something powerful awakens, a deeper kind of peace, a stillness that doesn't depend on happiness, only on truth. So if you're hurting tonight, know this: you are not broken, you are becoming. You are being reshaped by forces older than language, forces that don't care about fairness, but they do care about depth, about truth, about soul. Pain is the price of becoming real. That doesn't mean we should worship suffering. It means we should listen to it, follow it, ask what it's teaching, ask what it reveals. Not everything has a reason. Not every loss becomes wisdom, but some do. And those few, those rare, terrible, beautiful truths become the foundation of the self. Not the mask, but the real thing underneath, the ancient, aching core, the part that knows how to endure, and maybe, just maybe, how to love. There is something strange about human nature, a contradiction buried deep in the way we live. We want peace, but we are drawn to conflict. We crave comfort, but we grow only through pressure. We long for love, but we sabotage it. We fear death, but we live as if we are already ghosts. This is not a flaw, it is the architecture of the psyche. And tonight, we explore one of the most haunting truths of all: the war between what we want and what we are. Sigmund Freud believed that civilization was built on repression, that to become functional members of society, we must bury our instincts, our rage, our lust, our violence, our hunger for dominance. These raw impulses are not gone, they are just hidden. And the more we hide them, the more they find twisted ways to return. A joke, a slip of the tongue, a dream that makes no sense but leaves us shaken. The civilized self is a mask, a necessary mask, but the animal behind it still breathes. Carl Jung called this hidden side the shadow. He said the shadow is everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves, everything we exile, our envy, our cowardice, our cruelty, our secret desires. And he warned, the more we deny the shadow, the more power it gains. It does not disappear, it waits, it builds, and one day it takes over. Not as a monster, but as an accident, a breakdown, a moment of rage we cannot explain. The man who never gets angry punches a wall. The kind woman lashes out without warning. These are not random slips, they are eruptions, pressure escaping from a mind that tried too hard to be good. Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. We must face what we fear in ourselves. We must bring the shadow into the light, not to destroy it, but to understand it, to make peace with the beast, to live with both halves of the self. Because the shadow is not just evil, it contains power, creativity, confidence, desire, the raw energy of life itself. Without the shadow, we are not whole, we are hollow. The philosopher Nietzsche said that man is something that must be overcome. He saw the human as a bridge, not a destination, a process, not a product. And the overman, the one who transcends the average human condition, is not someone who avoids suffering, but someone who integrates it, who turns his wounds into weapons, his chaos into command, his shadow into strength. But here's the tragic twist. Most people will never meet their shadow, because most people never stop lying to themselves. They live in curated realities, echo chambers, digital mirrors that reflect back only what feels good. Social media has made this easier than ever. We post versions of ourselves that are carefully managed, endlessly filtered. We scroll through illusions and compare them to our reality. And slowly, we lose track of what's true. The the curated self becomes more real than the raw self, and the shadow grows stronger in the silence. This is not new, it's just louder now. Even in ancient myth, the shadow was always present. In Egyptian mythology, there was a part of the soul called the kybit, the shadow soul. It followed a person everywhere, watching. In Greek myth, Narcissus fell in love with his reflection and drowned in it, not because he was vain, but because he mistook illusion for reality. And perhaps that is what we are doing now, drowning in versions of ourselves that don't exist, while the real self starves in the dark. But there is a way back, and it begins with an old, difficult question. What do I hate in others? What irritates me? What enrages me? These reactions are often clues to the shadow. Freud called it projection. We reject something in ourselves, and then we see it everywhere outside of us. The liar hates liars. The insecure man mocks weakness. The person who wants freedom resents the free. It is easier to point than to reflect, easier to blame than to confess. But confession is where healing begins. To say, I am not only what I admire, I am also what I fear. I am capable of cruelty, of jealousy, of failure, of harm, and yet I am still worthy of understanding, still worthy of redemption. This kind of honesty is rare, it's terrifying, but it's also transformative, because once we see the shadow, we can stop being its puppet. We can make choices, not compulsions. We can respond instead of react. We can stop repeating old wounds in new disguises. Jung warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. They will create enemies, build ideologies, blame entire systems, but the truth remains. No revolution matters if the self remains unchanged. No external freedom means anything if we are still slaves to the parts of ourselves we cannot name. In modern psychology, this truth appears again and again. In therapy, in trauma work, in the study of addiction and compulsive behaviour. The shadow is not just metaphor, it's measurable. It lives in patterns, in the loops we cannot escape, the relationships we sabotage, the habits we can't break, the anger that rises too fast, the sadness we cannot explain. These are not symptoms, they are signals, clues, invitations. Not to fix, but to feel, to understand, to trace the roots of the storm. And if we do, if we follow the shadow down into the mind, we might find something unexpected. Not just pain, but power. The power to stop pretending, to stop performing, to be real. And being real is the most radical act in a world addicted to illusion. So tonight, in this silence, ask gently, what am I hiding? What am I afraid to see? Who am I when no one is watching? The answers won't come quickly, but they will come. And when they do, they will hurt, and they will heal, because every truth hurts before it frees, and every shadow, once faced, becomes a source of light. There is a kind of lie that doesn't look like a lie at all. It feels familiar, reassuring, safe. It's the lie of repetition. The more often we hear something, the more likely we are to believe it. Not because it makes sense, not because it's true, but simply because it echoes. This is the illusory truth effect, and it controls far more of your beliefs than you think. Imagine someone tells a lie just once. It's strange, it feels wrong, it slides off the mind. But if that lie is repeated again and again, across news, across conversations, across headlines and hashtags, something happens. It begins to feel true. Familiarity becomes mistaken for fact. The brain stops asking questions. It relaxes, it nods, it accepts. Not because it believes, but because it recognizes. This is how false memories form, how propaganda spreads, how cults and empires and belief systems are built. Not with logic, but with repetition. In 1977, psychologists Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Topino conducted a study. They showed participants a mix of true and false statements. Some were shown once, others were repeated, and they found something eerie. The more times someone saw a statement, even if it was false, the more likely they were to rate it as true. The participants didn't remember the source. They didn't fact-check. They just trusted the echo. The brain is lazy. It doesn't like to work harder than it has to. And familiarity is easy. Truth is complicated. And so, over time, we begin to believe things not because they are real, but because they are repeated. This is why slogans work, why advertising works, why rumors spread faster than facts. It's not about accuracy, it's about memory. Even if you know a claim is false, repeated exposure makes it feel safe, known, real. And that feeling of truth is enough to sway opinion, to change behavior, to shape entire realities. Think about how many things people believe simply because they've heard them 1,000 times. Sugar makes kids hyperactive. We only use 10% of our brains. Lightning never strikes the same place twice. All false, all repeated, and all widely believed. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "There are no facts, only interpretations." But what if even interpretations can be manufactured? Not by debate, but by design. This is where it becomes dangerous, because anyone who understands the illusory truth effect can use it to manipulate. Politicians, influencers, marketers, leaders, all they need is repetition. Say something confidently enough, say it often enough, and eventually people will stop resisting. They will start believing. Or worse, they won't even realize they believe it. It will slip in through the back door of the mind. Quiet, unnoticed. Now think about your own beliefs. Where did they come from? Did you choose them? Or did they choose you? Were they built from evidence? Or from exposure? If you had been born in a different time, a different country, a different culture, would you still believe them? Or would they have been replaced by different, but equally convincing illusions? This is not just abstract philosophy, it's everyday psychology. And it matters, because our beliefs shape everything, our choices, our values, our fears, our sense of self. If those beliefs are built on repetition, not reality, then who are we really? The philosopher Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." But what if the thoughts we think are not truly ours? What if we are echoes of echoes, reactions to programming we didn't choose? There is something terrifying and liberating in this idea. Terrifying because it means we are not as free as we thought. Liberating because once we see the trick, we can resist it. We can stop mistaking repetition for truth. We can ask harder questions. We can build our beliefs on evidence, not echoes. But it's not easy. The mind clings to what is familiar. Even lies can feel like home, especially when they come wrapped in comfort, wrapped in culture, wrapped in the voice of someone we trust. This is why critical thinking feels uncomfortable. It forces us to leave the familiar, to sit with uncertainty, to accept that maybe, just maybe, we were wrong. And that's painful, but pain is part of growth. Every real transformation begins with discomfort, with cognitive dissonance, with the quiet collapse of something we thought was solid. The brain does not want truth, it wants stability, predictability, safety. But philosophy does not offer safety. It offers depth. It offers the unsettling freedom of thinking for oneself, of questioning the frame, the illusion, the story. It means waking up in a world where nothing is obvious, nothing is certain, and in that uncertainty, something beautiful appears, the chance to become real, to become awake, to build a self that isn't shaped by slogans or shaped by systems, but shaped by deliberate thought, by chosen values, by careful observation. The writer George Orwell understood this deeply. In his novel 1984, the government rewrites history, changes facts, controls language, and the people believe it. Not because they're stupid, but because they are human. Because repetition is more powerful than logic. If you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes truth. Not because it's true, but because the alternative becomes unthinkable. This is not fiction. It is happening everywhere, in every algorithm, In every echo chamber, in every curated feed, we are being shaped slowly, subtly, repetition by repetition, until we no longer know what we know, only what we feel. And feeling is fragile, easy to bend, easy to break. So the question becomes, how do we protect our minds from this? How do we anchor ourselves to something solid? First, we must become suspicious of comfort, of anything that feels too easy to believe, too pleasant, too popular. Second, we must seek contradiction, opinions that challenge us, people who think differently. Third, we must trace the source. Where did this idea come from? Who benefits if I believe it? What evidence supports it? Not how often it is said, but whether it holds up when held to the light. Finally, we must be willing to be wrong. To let go, to change, that is the hardest part, but also the most powerful. Because the moment we stop defending old illusions, we make room for something new, something honest, something real. The truth may not comfort us, but it will ground us. And in a world made of echoes, that might be the only freedom left. There's a question that quietly haunts every thinking mind. Do we really choose, or are we just following a script? It feels like we decide, like we weigh options, like we have control. But what if that control is only an illusion? What if every thought, every preference, every decision was shaped long before we were aware of it? This is the old debate between determinism and free will, and it is darker than it first appears. Determinism says that every effect has a cause, that everything happening now is the inevitable result of what came before, that our choices are not free but forced by genetics, by environment, by biology, by history. If this is true, then nothing we do is truly ours. We are the end point of a long equation we did not write. The ancient Stoics believed in fate, not as superstition, but as the logical outcome of cause and effect. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Just that you do the right thing. The rest doesn't matter." He meant that we must play our part in the cosmic order without illusion. Accept what we cannot change. Endure what must be endured. Act with integrity, even in a determined world. But not everyone found this comforting. Jean-Paul Sartre, an existentialist, believed that freedom was real and terrifying. He said we are condemned to be free, because without external meaning, we are fully responsible for our choices. No fate to blame, no God to follow, only the brutal truth that everything we do, we must own. Sartre's world is not governed by destiny, but by despair, a blank canvas, a weightless drift through a meaningless universe, where meaning must be invented, not found, invented. That freedom is a burden. It means we can no longer hide. But here's where it gets strange. Modern neuroscience is siding with the determinists. In lab studies, researchers found that brain activity predicting a decision happens several seconds before a person becomes consciously aware of it. The brain makes the choice, the mind just catches up. We feel like we choose, but the choice is already made. The famous Libet experiment showed this in the 1980s. Participants were asked to press a button whenever they felt like it, and to note the moment they decided. But the brain's readiness potential, the signal of decision-making, happened before the conscious decision, before the self even knew what it would do. Later studies confirm this. Our choices are predicted by unconscious processes. Free will, if it exists, comes after the fact. It's not the steering wheel, it's the narration. And yet, we still feel responsible, we still feel guilty, proud, afraid, we punish criminals, we forgive friends, we judge ourselves. Even if everything was determined, we still experience it as choice. So what then? If free will is false, is morality meaningless? Are we just puppets of physics and chemistry? Is every murder, every act of kindness, just a chain of dominoes falling? Some philosophers offer a middle path, compatibilism. The idea that even in a determined universe, we can define freedom as acting in accordance with our character. even if our character was shaped by forces beyond our control. It's not full freedom, but it's not pure automation either. It allows for ethics, for responsibility, for meaning. It says, yes, the river has a current, but we still swim. Not freely, but intentionally. And maybe that's enough. Friedrich Nietzsche had a more radical view. He saw the obsession with free will as a trick, a moral weapon invented to create guilt. He wrote, "The concept of free will was invented to make the guilty feel guilty. If we are told we are free, then we are blamed for every failure, every weakness, every sin. But if we are not free, then we are not guilty. We are only products, machines, flesh acting out its programming." This is terrifying, but it is also a form of mercy, a way to forgive ourselves, to stop believing that we should have done better, could have done better. Perhaps, given who we were at that moment, there was no other path, no alternate version of the event, no other outcome, just the one that happened, the only one that could. But if we believe this, can we still grow? Can we still change? Maybe the answer lies not in trying to escape the script, but in learning to rewrite it, slowly, over time. If the brain is plastic, if habits can be reprogrammed, if beliefs can be challenged, then perhaps we are not free in the moment, but we can become freer across time. We can stretch the margins of the page, choose what we expose ourselves to, who we listen to, what we practice. And those choices, while shaped by the past, can shape the future. A kind of recursive freedom, not absolute, but real. The freedom to influence who we become. Viktor Frankl believed in this kind of freedom. He wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." He was in a concentration camp when he wrote that, surrounded by death, starvation, cruelty, and still he believed in inner freedom, the ability to create meaning, even in a cage, even in hell. Frankl's freedom was not about choice in the usual sense. It was deeper. The choice of how to respond, how to endure, how to live when life offers nothing but suffering. That kind of freedom cannot be measured by brain scans. It lives in the soul, in the fire behind the eyes, in the quiet refusal to surrender the last bit of self. So tonight, think softly about this. Are you free, or are you following a path written long before you could read? And if you are following it, could you, if only slightly, begin to turn, begin to bend the path, begin to write a new line at the end of the sentence? Maybe the truth is this: we are not free in the way we imagine, but we are not helpless either. We are shaped, but we are also shapers. Every habit we build becomes part of the future. Every thought we allow becomes part of the self. Every act, even small, pushes the wheel in a direction. And over time, those tiny pushes add up. They become fate. And if we are careful, if we are mindful, if we are brave, we might shape a fate we can live with. Not one we chose freely, but one we chose meaningfully. There is a strange comfort in rules, a quiet safety in structure. Most people don't realize how deeply they crave control until it slips from their fingers. But behind every law, every habit, every social script, there lies something more primal: the fear of chaos. Not the loud kind with fire and riots and storm, but the quiet kind, the creeping kind, the inner kind, the chaos inside the mind when nothing makes sense, when the old beliefs collapse, when the mask falls off. This fear of disorder, of meaninglessness, is ancient, and it explains more about human behavior than we like to admit. People do not simply want truth, they want stability, predictability, a frame to hold the weight of life. But what happens when that frame cracks? When the order we depended on breaks down? When the map no longer matches the territory? That is when the real self is revealed. That is when the dark philosophy begins. Carl Jung believed that too much order was just as dangerous as too much chaos. Too much order leads to tyranny. Too much chaos leads to madness. The goal, he said, is not to avoid chaos, but to integrate it, to balance the opposites, to hold both structure and freedom without falling into either extreme. This is not an easy task. It requires shadow work, honesty, courage, and a willingness to sit in discomfort. Most people won't do it. They'll cling to certainty, they'll follow authority, they'll avoid the unknown, but the unknown doesn't disappear. It waits, it grows, and eventually it erupts in a crisis, in a breakdown, in a moment where the old rules stop working. Jordan Peterson, a controversial but insightful thinker, built much of his philosophy on this tension between order and chaos. He said that order is where we find tradition, safety, and meaning. Chaos is where we find possibility, transformation, and danger. Too much order and life becomes stale, rigid, oppressive. Too much chaos and it becomes overwhelming, disorienting, traumatic. The ideal, he argued, is to walk the line between the two, to place one foot in order and one foot in chaos. That is where growth happens. That is where meaning lives. But walking that line requires awareness, presence, discipline, and the willingness to let go of certainty. The willingness to ask, what am I clinging to? What structure am I hiding inside? And is it serving me, or is it suffocating me? Nietzsche understood this too. He called for the death of God, not as celebration, but as a warning. With the collapse of religious order, the modern world faced a new problem: the abyss, a vacuum of meaning, a freedom so vast it became paralyzing. God is dead, he wrote, and we have killed him. But in his absence, who would decide what is right, what is good, what is true? Without a higher order, we are left with chaos. And in that chaos, the risk is not that people become free. The risk is that they invent new tyrannies, new ideologies, new absolute truths. And so the cycle begins again. Order collapses, chaos rises, and from the chaos, new order is born. But always at a cost, always with blood, always with belief systems built, not from wisdom, but from fear. That's what makes this topic so quietly disturbing. It reveals how fragile civilization really is, how thin the layer of structure is over the primal urges beneath, how quickly the mind reverts to tribalism, superstition, violence when the frame breaks. Think of how people behave during disaster, during war, during sudden collapse. The rules evaporate, and what emerges is not the rational self, but the desperate animal, hungry, angry, afraid. This is not just about society, it's about the self. Each person has an internal structure, an identity, a worldview, a story they tell themselves about who they are. But what happens when that story shatters? When trauma hits? When betrayal cuts deep? When the safe assumptions are ripped away? That is when the ego breaks, and something deeper is revealed, the raw, unfiltered psyche. Jung said this was the beginning of individuation, the painful process of becoming whole, of integrating the pieces, of building a self that is not based on illusion, but on experience, real experience, not theories, not borrowed beliefs, but lived truth. And truth, when it is real, is rarely comforting. It is often cold, complex, ambiguous. It does not wrap itself in easy slogans. It does not protect the ego. It strips it. And in that stripping, in that cold, something solid appears. Something that cannot be taken away. Not status, not opinion, but soul. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "The only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance." He saw chaos not as an enemy, but as a partner. Something to be danced with, not defeated. But to do that, we must stop fearing it. We must stop trying to make everything make sense, because some things don't. Some things hurt without reason. Some questions have no answer, and yet we live through them. We survive, we adapt, we become. That is the miracle, not the logic, but the endurance, the ability to suffer and still create meaning, to lose and still choose kindness, to fall into chaos and still crawl back with something new, something real. So tonight, ask softly, what structures am I clinging to? What rules have I mistaken for truth? What part of me is still afraid of the unknown? And could I, just for a moment, let go? Not forever, not recklessly, but gently. Could I loosen the grip? Could I allow some uncertainty, some change, some mystery? Because in that mystery, there is power. In that chaos, there is rebirth, not as escape, but as evolution, as the next chapter of the self, as the deeper self, the one that knows how to bend without breaking, the one that knows that life is not meant to be controlled, but understood. There is a trap in the human mind that catches even the smartest people, a soft, sticky trap, invisible but everywhere. It's called confirmation bias, and it means this: once a person believes something, they begin to see the world through that belief. Not neutrally, not honestly, but selectively. They notice what confirms their idea. They ignore what contradicts it. And slowly, without realizing it, they stop learning. They stop thinking. They start defending. Not searching, not questioning, just defending. This bias lives in everyone, in every mind. It's not evil. It's not rare, it's human. It's how the brain protects itself. We like to think we form beliefs based on facts, but most of the time, it's the other way around. We form beliefs emotionally, then we go looking for facts to justify them. Like lawyers, not scientists, we're not seeking truth, we're building a case. And if a new piece of information fits our story, we accept it without effort. If it doesn't, we attack it, mock it, ignore it, dismiss the source, question the motive, anything to keep the belief safe. Because the belief is not just a thought, it's part of the identity. To question it feels like death, so we cling. And in clinging, we become blind. This is how people become trapped in cults, in conspiracy theories, in political bubbles, in toxic ideologies. They surround themselves with mirrors, with echoes, with yes men. And over time, the belief becomes unshakable, not because it's true, but because it's insulated, unquestioned, repeated, reinforced. The philosopher Francis Bacon warned of this long ago. He called them idols of the cave, personal biases that distort how we see the world. Each person lives in a mental cave, shaped by their experiences, education, fears and desires. And if they never leave that cave, never doubt its walls, they mistake its shadows for reality. Plato told a similar story. In his famous allegory of the cave, people are chained inside a cave their whole lives, watching shadows on the wall. They think the shadows are real. They don't know they're just reflections of something else. And when one person escapes and sees the real world, then comes back to tell the others, they don't believe him. They call him crazy. They'd rather keep the shadows, the lies, the comfort. That's confirmation bias, the refusal to see beyond the wall. Even when the truth is right there, even when it's obvious. Because obvious truths feel threatening when they go against the identity. That's why arguing rarely works. Facts bounce off beliefs, like stones off armor. And the more you push, the tighter they cling. Not because they're stupid, but because they're scared. Changing your mind means admitting you were wrong, admitting you were fooled, that you wasted time, energy, loyalty on something false. And that kind of self-betrayal is painful. So most people won't do it. Even when shown the facts, even when offered proof, they'll twist the logic, they'll double down, and they'll call it conviction. But it's not conviction, it's fear in a costume. Real conviction can survive questioning. Real confidence allows doubt. It welcomes challenge. Because it's not fragile, it's not defensive. It's built on curiosity, not control. And curiosity is the antidote to confirmation bias. It's the only thing that keeps the mind flexible, alive, open. But curiosity is exhausting. It requires energy, humility, the willingness to be wrong, the ability to sit in uncertainty. And that's rare, because the world rewards certainty. the loudest voice, the cleanest answer, the black or white take. Grey is uncomfortable, nuance is boring, doubt is seen as weakness. But in philosophy, doubt is the beginning of wisdom. Socrates said, "I know that I know nothing." He wasn't being humble, he was being honest. He understood that every belief must be examined, scraped, tested, and even then, it might still be wrong. That's not a failure, that's a feature. The goal is not to be right, the goal is to keep seeing, to keep sharpening, to keep evolving. That's why the real danger of confirmation bias is not in what it makes us believe, but in what it stops us from ever considering. It narrows the path, it silences the strange, the new, the uncomfortable. It builds a prison with walls made of our own thoughts. And most people decorate those walls, hang pictures, settle in. They never notice they're locked in, because it feels like home. But not all thoughts are meant to be homes. Some are meant to be tents, temporary, flexible, easy to move, easy to leave behind. The mind must travel, must wander, must question the map. Or else it becomes stale, predictable, hollow. The writer Anis Nin said, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are." And this is why philosophy matters, because it teaches us to see ourselves first, to question not just the world, but the lens through which we view it. That's where transformation begins, not with better answers, but with better questions. So tonight, ask softly, what am I sure of? And why? Where did that belief come from? Have I ever doubted it? Have I tested it? Or have I just repeated it? Have I built a case around it? Protected it like a child? If I were wrong, would I even want to know? Could I bear it? Or would I look away? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, because a mind that cannot question itself is not a mind, it's a machine. And truth does not come to machines. It comes to those who are willing to be dismantled, who are brave enough to change shape, who are humble enough to say, "I might be wrong." And in that moment, in that crack, something new enters. Not certainty, but clarity, not comfort, but light. A softer kind of truth, one that grows slowly, quietly, honestly. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't argue, just waits until the mind is ready to see. There is a quiet irony at the heart of human nature. The more a person chases happiness, the more it slips away, like smoke between fingers, like a dream that fades as the eyes open. It isn't that happiness is impossible, it's that it resists being captured. It cannot be forced, it cannot be held. The pursuit itself creates pressure, and pressure crushes the very thing it seeks. This is not a poetic idea, it is a psychological truth. Studies show that people who rate happiness as their highest goal often report lower life satisfaction. They are constantly measuring, comparing, questioning, am I happy yet? Is this enough? And every time the answer is no, disappointment grows. The expectation becomes a shadow, a weight. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, saw this clearly. He said, "Happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue. It must arise as a byproduct of meaning, of purpose, of living for something beyond oneself." In the camps, he saw that those who survived were not the strongest, but those who had a reason to survive. A child, a dream, a belief, something that gave their suffering a shape, a frame, a story. Without that, the pain became unbearable. Meaningless suffering is unbearable, but meaningful suffering, strangely, can be endured, even transformed. Frankl called this logotherapy, the healing through meaning. And in that idea lies something radical. It means that pain, tragedy, and loss do not have to destroy us. They can deepen us, expand us, teach us, but only if we allow them to. Only if we stop asking, how can I feel better? And start asking, what does this mean? That shift from pleasure to purpose is subtle, but it is everything. Because pleasure fades, it is fleeting, addictive, always needing more, a new hit, a better thrill. But meaning grows. It roots. It builds something solid, something that can hold us when everything else breaks. But modern life does not encourage this. It sells happiness as a product, a lifestyle, a filter. It tells people that if they just do more, buy more, glow more, they'll find it. But they don't. Because happiness is not found in consumption. It is found in confrontation. Confrontation with the truth, with mortality, with failure, with the self. And that is uncomfortable. Most people don't want to go there. They want distraction, dopamine, escape. But escape does not lead to peace, it leads to numbness. A soft kind of despair, the kind that doesn't scream but sighs. Nietzsche warned of this in his idea of the last man, a future where people no longer seek greatness, danger, or depth, but only comfort, safety, entertainment. The last man has no passion, no purpose. He just wants to feel good, to avoid pain, to stay neutral. He survives but does not live. And Nietzsche hated this because he saw suffering not as a mistake, but as a path. He wrote, "To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." He believed that to be human was to wrestle with life, to confront its absurdity, to carve meaning into its indifference, and in doing so, to become stronger, sharper, real. But how many people live this way now? How many face their pain directly? How many ask, "What is this teaching me? What is this shaping in me?" Instead, the pain is silenced, medicated, distracted, and the lesson is lost. The wound festers, becomes bitterness or apathy. But pain ignored is not pain erased. It waits, it returns. And when it does, it demands attention. It demands change. Pain is a signal, not an enemy. It says something is misaligned. Something needs to be faced. And if we listen, truly listen, it becomes a teacher. A cruel teacher, but a wise one. This is the dark truth of happiness. It does not come from ease, it comes from depth. From facing the hard things, from enduring them, and from turning them into something beautiful. A poem, a kindness, a strength, a truth. That's the paradox. The deepest joy often grows from the deepest sorrow, because sorrow cracks the surface. It opens us, makes us raw, vulnerable. And in that rawness, we connect. We feel, we see clearly. The superficial falls away, and what remains is real, solid, grounded. That's why the people who have suffered often become the wisest, the most compassionate, the most alive. Not because they enjoyed it, but because they emerged, changed, transformed. The philosopher Alain de Botton said, "A good half of the art of living is resilience." Resilience is not avoiding the fall, it's learning how to fall, how to get back up, how to use the fall, not as failure, but as foundation. So tonight, think softly about your own pursuit of happiness. What have you been chasing, and why? Is it working, or has it become another burden? Could you, just for a moment, let go of the chase? Could you turn inward, not outward? Could you ask, not what will make you feel good, but what will make you feel real? Because realness matters more than happiness. Truth matters more than mood. And in truth, happiness might arise, quietly, unexpectedly, like a bird landing on your hand when you've stopped reaching. That's how it works. It doesn't come when called. It comes when there is space, when there is honesty, when the heart has made room for it, not by craving, but by clearing, by surrendering the illusion of control, by accepting the sadness, and by finding in that sadness something human, something warm, something that cannot be sold or staged or filtered, something that simply is, and maybe that is enough. There's a soft lie that lives deep inside many people, a whisper that says, if they are kind, if they are generous, if they are good, life will be fair to them. That fairness will follow virtue, that good things will come to good people. But the world does not work that way. Life is not a moral accountant. It does not tally kindness and reward it with fortune. It does not punish cruelty with lightning bolts. Bad people win. Good people suffer. Tragedy is not distributed by merit. It is scattered by chance. And the sooner a person sees this, the freer they become. This is the unsettling truth of moral luck. The idea that outcomes are not always aligned with intention. That someone can do everything right and still lose. That someone can do everything wrong and still rise. It doesn't sit well. It doesn't feel just. But justice is not a law of physics. It is a human invention, a hope, a structure we place over chaos to make it bearable. And yet, when that structure fails, people collapse. They ask, why me? They search for reasons. They blame themselves. They imagine invisible sins. They try to earn their way back into favor. But the universe is not watching. It is not keeping score. It is not fair. It is indifferent. And that indifference, once accepted, is not a curse. It is a release. It frees the mind from expectation, from bargaining, from the illusion of cosmic deals. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, understood this. He taught that we must focus only on what is within our control, our thoughts, our actions, our character. Everything else, outcomes, reactions, fortune, belongs to fate. And to be at peace, one must let go of what belongs to fate. That doesn't mean giving up. It means giving in. Not to weakness, but to reality. To see the world clearly and act anyway. To do what is right, not because it pays off, but because it defines who we are. That is the highest strength, but it's rare. Because most people act with strings attached. They are kind to be seen, generous to be liked, helpful to be owed. And when life doesn't repay them, they turn bitter. They say, I did everything right. Why did this happen to me? But that question is built on a false premise. It assumes a moral contract that doesn't exist. There is no contract, only chaos. The writer Thomas Hardy wrote novels where good people suffered and bad people thrived. He saw the cruelty of the world as a kind of grim poetry. His characters didn't find justice. They found reality. And in that reality, there was beauty. Not in the outcome, but in the endurance, in the quiet dignity of continuing. That is the art, not of winning, but of withstanding, of refusing to let unfairness make us unfair, of refusing to let cruelty make us cruel. That is the real test, not how life treats us, but how we respond. The psychologist Martin Seligman studied helplessness. He found that when people are exposed to random punishment, pain with no escape, no pattern, they eventually stop trying. They become passive. Even when escape becomes possible, they stay. They've learned that effort doesn't matter. That hope is dangerous. That trying leads to pain. He called it learned helplessness, and it explains much of human despair. People who grow up in chaotic homes, unjust systems, unstable lives, they learn that goodness doesn't protect them. And so they stop being good. They stop believing. They retreat, or they fight blindly, not from hope, but from fear. But this is not the only path. Some people see the same unfairness and choose to rise anyway, not because they expect reward, but because they refuse to sink. They choose character over outcome, principle over payoff. They become what Camus called the absurd hero, the one who knows the world is unjust and keeps going anyway. Like Sisyphus, rolling his stone, not out of delusion but out of defiance, Camus said. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, because in that struggle, in that refusal to quit, there is meaning, not given, but created, and that is the power we all have, to make meaning even when none is offered, to act with honor even when no one notices, to be kind even when it hurts. That is not weakness, that is philosophy in motion, that is strength carved from chaos. But it requires letting go of the story we've been sold. The story that says good things happen to good people. That says life is a vending machine of morality. Insert virtue, receive happiness. That story is comforting. but false and dangerous. Because when it breaks, people break with it. They think, if I am suffering, I must be bad. Or worse, if others are suffering, they must deserve it. And that leads to cruelty, to blame, to justification of injustice. But pain is not proof of guilt. Misfortune is not earned. Sometimes it just is. Random, undeserved, brutal, and in accepting that, we can become gentler, softer. We stop needing reasons for everything. We stop judging. We start seeing. We start holding space for complexity, for mystery, for the unfairness that shapes us all. And in that space, compassion grows. Not pity, but connection. A quiet understanding that we are all exposed, all vulnerable, all walking through a world that does not always make sense. So tonight, think gently. What have you been trying to earn? What reward have you been promised? What fairness do you expect? And could you, just for a moment, let that go? Could you act without bargaining? Could you give without guarantee? Could you be good even when life is not? That is the test and the triumph. To be a candle in the storm, not to light the world, but to refuse the darkness. There's something quietly disturbing about the way people lie to themselves. Not the big, loud lies, but the soft ones, the daily ones, the ones that slip in without permission. A person says, I'm fine, and when they're breaking, says, I don't care when they do, says, I've moved on when they haven't. These aren't lies to others, they're lies to the self. And they're dangerous, because over time, the mind starts to believe them, starts to build around them, and soon the real feeling is buried, forgotten. The lie becomes a habit, a second skin. This is called self-deception, and it is everywhere. It is not a flaw of the few. It is the condition of being human. The brain protects itself from pain by distorting reality, and it does so quietly, elegantly. It rewrites memory, reframes events, shifts blame, invents reasons, anything to keep the self-image intact. Because the truth is often too painful to hold, too threatening, too raw. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the tension between conflicting thoughts. The mind doesn't like tension, so it edits, adjusts, lies, not maliciously, but mechanically, automatically. And in doing so, it loses something precious: clarity, integrity, reality. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith. It means pretending not to know what we know, pretending we have no choice, pretending we are just victims of circumstance. It is a way of avoiding responsibility, of hiding from freedom. Because freedom is frightening. It means we have power, and power means we have no excuses. So we trade freedom for comfort and tell ourselves stories. We say, it's not my fault. I had no choice. That's just who I am. And maybe we believe it. But some part of us always knows, always remembers. That's why shame lingers, why guilt returns, why the mirror becomes harder to face. Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And he was right. The soul contains things we don't want to see, desires we deny, fears we bury, truths we repress. But repression is not deletion, it is storage. And what is stored returns, in dreams, in symptoms, in strange behaviours we can't explain. We sabotage relationships, we chase things that hurt us, we fear things that haven't happened. And we call it fate. But it's not fate, it's the echo of ignored truths. It's the shadow we refuse to look at. Jung called this the shadow self, the part of us we reject. It contains anger, envy, weakness, lust, but also power, creativity, intuition. To deny it is to live half a life, a shallow life, a performative life, but to face it, to integrate it, is to become whole. That's the path of individuation, not becoming good, but becoming real. And realness is rare, because it requires honesty, radical honesty, not to others, but to the self, to say, I am afraid, I am jealous. I want more. I don't know who I am. These are hard things to admit, but in admitting them, we begin to change, begin to heal, begin to see clearly. And that clarity is painful, but powerful, because only what is seen can be transformed. What is denied festers. What is faced dissolves. That's why confession is so ancient, not as punishment, but as release. A way of naming the truth, of reclaiming the self from the lie. But modern life discourages confession. It rewards performance, branding, image. People curate themselves like products. They post smiles, they hide tears, they turn their pain into content, and their loneliness into aesthetics. But inside they starve, not for attention, but for authenticity, for something real, something unfiltered, something that doesn't need to be liked. That's what makes philosophy different. It doesn't sell answers. It asks questions, hard ones, ugly ones. And in doing so, it invites us back to ourselves. Not the public self, but the private one. The one that wakes at night. The one that remembers. The one that wonders quietly, if this is all there is. That self cannot be fooled forever. It waits, watches, and when the performance cracks, it speaks. Sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as sadness, sometimes as a voice that says, "This isn't who I am." That's the moment to listen, to pause, to ask, what have I been avoiding? What lie have I told so often I forgot it was a lie? What truth have I buried beneath politeness, ambition, fear? And what would happen if I told it? Just to myself. Just once. Would the world end? Or would something begin? Something new, something honest. That's the risk and the reward. To stop pretending, to stop editing, to say, this is me, not as excuse, but as declaration. And then to ask, what do I want to do with that truth? Not hide it, not broadcast it, just hold it, breathe with it, let it reshape the path. That's where real change starts, not with a plan, but with a reckoning, a moment of silence, a moment of seeing, and from there, a new direction. One that isn't based on lies, but on light. So tonight, before sleep, ask softly, where have I been dishonest with myself? What pain have I disguised as peace? What failure have I renamed as fate? And what truth is waiting patiently to be heard? Not judged, not solved, just heard. Because truth, when welcomed, becomes a guide. A quiet one, but a true one. There's a kind of madness in perfectionism that most people mistake for virtue. It looks like ambition, it looks like discipline, it looks like care, but underneath it lives fear. Not drive, not excellence, fear. The fear of being exposed, of being rejected, of being less than ideal. And so the perfectionist polishes everything. Their work, their words, their image, their emotions. They try to control it all, every detail, every outcome. They live in a tight frame, scared of cracks, but cracks always come. Because perfection is not possible. Not in nature, not in art, not in love, not in life. It is a fantasy, a myth, a moving target, and chasing it is exhausting. Because no matter how much is achieved, it is never enough. There's always something more to fix, something more to improve, and the joy disappears. The process becomes punishment. The self becomes a project, a problem to be solved. The philosopher Alain de Botton once said, "Perfection is the enemy of contentment." Because it creates a constant gap between what is and what should be. It breeds dissatisfaction, restlessness, shame, and that shame is deep. It says, if I am not perfect, I am not worthy. If I make a mistake, I am a mistake. This is not rational, it is emotional, often rooted in childhood, in early praise that made love feel conditional, or in criticism that made failure feel fatal. And so the child learns to perform, to overachieve, to be exceptional, not for joy, but for safety, to earn approval, to avoid punishment, and that pattern hardens, becomes identity. The straight A student, the tireless worker, the flawless friend, the one who never breaks, never rests, never asks for help. But inside they are tired, cracked, starving for softness, for the freedom to be imperfect. But freedom feels dangerous, because in their mind mistakes mean abandonment, rejection, collapse. So they push harder, smile wider, work longer, until the breakdown comes, quietly, suddenly. A panic attack, a burnout, a numbness that won't lift. And they don't understand, because they were doing everything right. They were trying so hard. But that's the problem. Trying too hard to be inhuman, to transcend flaw, to bypass mess. But mess is life. It's where the real stuff happens. The learning, the laughter, the intimacy. Think of the people who feel safe, who feel warm. Are they perfect? Number. They're real. They're open. They admit when they're wrong. They cry when they need to. They show their scars. And in doing so, they invite connection. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's magnetism. It's truth. And truth heals. But the perfectionist avoids it. They wear masks. They build walls. And they wonder why they feel alone. Why no one really sees them. But how can they be seen if they never show up fully? If they edit themselves into a version that doesn't exist? That's the tragedy. Perfectionism doesn't protect, it isolates. It creates distance from others, from peace, from the self. The psychologist Brené Brown has written beautifully about this. She says that perfectionism is not self-improvement, it's a defense mechanism. It's about earning love, avoiding blame, minimizing risk. But the cost is high. Creativity dies, joy dies. The moment becomes a test and life becomes performance. But there is a way out, and it begins with failure, not as shame, but as teacher, as truth teller. Failure reveals what matters, what doesn't, who cares, who doesn't. It strips the illusion, and what remains is solid, real, honest. The Japanese have a concept called wabi-sabi. It means finding beauty in imperfection, in asymmetry, in the cracks. They repair broken pottery with gold, not to hide the break, but to honor it, to say, this was broken, and now it's stronger, more beautiful, because of the break, not despite it. That's the shift, from shame to reverence, from editing to embracing, from chasing perfection to celebrating process. This doesn't mean lowering standards. It means changing the goal, from flawless to full, from polished to true, from admired to alive. Because perfection might impress, but imperfection connects. And connection is what we really crave, not applause, but understanding, not approval, but love, the messy kind, the real kind, the kind that sees the worst and stays. But to receive that kind of love, we must first give it to ourselves. We must say, I am enough, not when I achieve, not when I impress, now, here, as I am. And in saying that, something softens, the grip loosens, the breath deepens, and life becomes livable. Not a test, not a stage, but a space to try, to stumble, to rise, to rest. So tonight, whisper gently, where am I chasing perfection? Where am I hiding my humanness? What would it feel like to let go? To be seen in my mess, to be loved not for my shine, but for my cracks, not for my performance, but for my presence? Ask that, hold that, let it wash through you. Because in that question, there is peace, not the peace of control, but the peace of surrender, of being real, and knowing that real is enough. There is a soft, aching kind of loneliness that lives inside many people, even when they're surrounded by others. It doesn't come from being alone. It comes from not being seen, from feeling like a ghost in your own life, talking, smiling, nodding, while something inside is silent, unnoticed, untouched. This is existential loneliness, and it is older than language. It is the quiet realization that no one can ever truly know what it feels like to be inside your mind. That no matter how much you explain, describe, perform, there is a part of you that remains untranslated, untranslatable. And in that space, a question whispers, does anyone really know me? Does anyone want to? Most people don't say this out loud. They distract themselves. They scroll, they smile, they laugh at the right times. But when the noise dies down, the question returns. It returns in hotel rooms, in early mornings, in late night drives, in moments that should feel full, but somehow don't. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer believed that humans were essentially isolated beings, each locked in their own consciousness, using words like ropes thrown across a canyon, helpful, but always incomplete. Even love, he thought, was often an illusion, a temporary escape from the truth of separateness. It's a bleak view, but not entirely wrong, because real connection is rare. Most conversations are surface, most relationships are habit, and most people wear masks so convincingly they forget they're wearing them. They say what's expected, they do what's safe, they become what others need, and they vanish in the process. Vanish behind roles, behind jobs, behind smiles, until one day they look in the mirror and don't recognize the reflection. Not because the face is unfamiliar, but because the soul has been quiet for too long. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "Love consists in this, that two solitudes protect and touch and greet each other." Solitudes, not halves of a whole, not rescues, not mirrors, but separate, whole beings who see each other clearly and still choose to stay. That is rare, because seeing clearly means seeing the darkness, the flaws, the past, and staying means accepting it all. Most people aren't ready for that. They want the version that's easy, the edited version, the highlight reel. But real connection doesn't come from perfection. It comes from exposure, from being seen in the raw, the boring, the scared. From saying, this is who I am when I stop performing. Can you still stay? And even more painfully, can I stay with myself? That's the deeper question, because sometimes the loneliness we feel isn't about others at all. It's about the parts of ourselves we've abandoned, the dreams we've shelved, the truths we've silenced, the parts we hide, even from our own reflection. Carl Jung believed that integration, becoming whole, required facing these forgotten parts, not rejecting them, not fixing them, but holding them, listening, making space for the lost voices within. Only then, he said, could the self become unified. Until then, we are split, fractured, lonely not because we are unloved, but because we are unknown, especially to ourselves. And so the work begins not with seeking others, but with returning inward. Not to analyze, but to notice, to ask, where did I go missing? What part of me have I ignored? Where did I stop being honest? What truth have I been afraid to speak, even in silence? These are the questions that soften the loneliness. Not solve it, but soften it. Because loneliness is not always a problem to fix. Sometimes it's a signal, a longing, a sacred hunger for something real. And that hunger can lead us back. Back to connection, back to expression, back to the self. But only if we stop numbing it. Only if we stop calling it weakness. Only if we allow it to ache, to speak, to lead. That's hard. Because we're taught to hide our hunger, to mask our needs, to act like we're fine. But fine is a prison. It keeps everything neat, acceptable, unthreatening. But beneath fine lies fury, longing, wildness. And wildness is not bad. It is the part of us that refuses to be tamed by expectation. That demands truth. That wants to feel deeply, even if it hurts. That's what loneliness is sometimes. A rebellion, a protest against superficiality, a demand for depth, not more people, but more presence, more honesty, more risk, to say what you really think, to ask what you really want, to sit with someone in silence and let it be enough. That's rare, and sacred, and worth the ache, because the ache shows you care, shows you're awake, shows you're still willing to feel. That's the first step, to stop pretending you're not lonely, to say it, to name it, to sit with it like an old friend, and then to ask, What is it trying to show me? What connection am I missing? What part of me have I left behind? And who might see it if I dare to reveal it? Not everyone will, but someone might. And that one moment of being seen, truly seen, can change everything. It doesn't erase the loneliness, but it gives it meaning. It says, I'm not alone in this feeling. I'm not broken, I'm human. That's what philosophy reminds us. That pain is not personal, it's universal. And in that universality, we find a kind of comfort, a quiet solidarity, a candle in the dark. So tonight, let yourself feel it. The ache, the hunger, the question. Don't rush to solve it. Don't cover it up. Just let it breathe. And in that breath, you might hear something new, something real, something that sounds like home. There is a strange quiet violence in how people try to fix others. It often looks like love. It sounds like care. But beneath the surface, it is control. A soft attempt to bend someone's truth into a shape that feels comfortable, digestible, familiar. People say, I just want what's best for them. But often what they mean is, I want them to be less difficult to love, less messy, less confused, less human. And so they offer advice no one asked for. They push healing that hasn't been invited. They call it support, but it feels like pressure, like judgment dressed as concern. This is not always conscious. Often it comes from fear, from the discomfort of watching someone fall apart, from the panic of not being able to stop it. And so instead of sitting with them in the dark, they reach for the light switch. But some wounds are not ready for light. Some truths need darkness to unfold, need silence, stillness, space. This is the tragedy of good intentions. They can hurt, because not everyone wants to be saved. Not everyone is ready to change. And even if they are, it may not be in the way we imagined. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, if one is truly to succeed in leading a person to a specific place, one must first and foremost take care to find them where they are and begin there. But most people don't begin there. They begin where they are, from their own map, their own fears, their own ideas of what a healed person should look like. And so they talk past each other, miss each other, hurt each other, all while believing they're helping. But real help is quiet, gentle, patient. It does not push, it waits, it listens, it respects the timing of pain. Because healing is not a straight line, it's a spiral, a collapse, a crawl, and no one can walk it for someone else. They can only walk beside. But walking beside means accepting the mess, the confusion, the resistance. It means saying, I will not fix you, but I will not leave you. That is rare, because people want results. They want visible change. They want their efforts to matter. But sometimes the most powerful thing is doing nothing. Just witnessing, just staying, just holding the space without trying to fill it. That's hard, especially when we love someone, especially when we see them suffer. But love is not rescue. Love is presence, and presence requires humility. The humility to admit, I don't have the answers. I can't make this better. I can only be here. And sometimes that is enough, more than enough. Because most people don't want solutions. They want understanding, not direction, but acceptance. Carl Rogers, the founder of humanistic psychology, believed that unconditional, positive regard, the deep acceptance of a person without judgment, was the most healing force in therapy. Not technique, not insight, just being seen, fully, without trying to be changed. That's what people long for. That's what they rarely get. Instead, they get advice, fixes, motivational speeches. But the soul does not respond to speeches, it responds to stillness, to empathy, to truth. And the truth is, every person is a mystery, a storm of memory, desire, fear, and contradiction. No one can be neatly solved. No one can be healed on command. That's not how growth works. That's not how grief moves. It doesn't care about convenience. It doesn't follow logic. It rises and falls like a tide. It needs to be felt, not managed. But our culture is obsessed with managing, with optimization, with turning people into projects, fixing their diet, their mindset, their schedule, their trauma. But humans are not machines. They are stories, and stories take time. They unfold, they regress, they twist, and trying to rush that story is like yelling at a flower to bloom. It doesn't help, it only startles. So the question becomes, can we sit with someone in their winter, without suggesting spring, without reminding them of sunshine? Can we trust that their season will shift when it's ready? Can we honour their darkness without fearing it? That is real support, not fixing, not saving, just witnessing. And in that witnessing, something sacred happens. The person feels safe, not because we have answers, but because we are not afraid of their pain. And when pain is no longer feared, it begins to soften, to speak, to heal, slowly, quietly, in its own way. That's the paradox. The less we try to force healing, the more room we create for it. The less we try to shape someone, the more they feel free to become themselves. Not a version we imagined, but something true, something whole. So tonight, think gently, who have you been trying to fix? And why? What fear lives beneath that effort? What part of their struggle mirrors something you haven't faced in yourself? And could you, just for a moment, let go of the urge to save? Could you trust their path, their pace? Could you love them without conditions, without edits, without urgency? That's not easy. But it is rare, and rare things change lives. There is a cruel little paradox at the centre of human nature, a quiet tension between the desire to be known and the fear of being seen, between the craving for intimacy and the panic that arises when someone gets too close, because to be fully seen means to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable means to risk everything. So most people build masks, not to deceive others, but to protect themselves, not from harm, but from exposure, from the unbearable thought that if someone saw the truth of them, their doubts, their anger, their strangeness, they would be left unloved, misunderstood, and so they present versions of themselves that are smoother, simpler, easier to digest. They speak in ways that make them likable, agreeable, safe, but inside they ache for something real, for someone who says, "I see who you are, and I am not afraid." But that kind of recognition is rare and terrifying, because it means putting down the performance. It means being honest, not just with others, but with the self. And that's where things get strange, because after years of pretending, the line between mask and self begins to blur, and people forget who they really are, what they really want. They confuse the character they've created with the person they once were, and then wonder why they feel lost, empty, invisible. This is the tragedy of persona, what Carl Jung called the social mask, the part of us that adapts to fit in, to survive, to be accepted. And it serves a purpose. It helps us navigate society, jobs, families. But when the mask becomes the identity, the soul begins to rot. Slowly, silently, the authentic self withers beneath layers of shoulds and scripts and expectations, until one day, often in midlife, a quiet crisis erupts. Not always loud, not always visible, but unmistakable to the person feeling it. A sense of disconnection, of what am I doing, of whose life is this? And this is what Jung called the call to individuation, the deep, often painful process of stripping away the false self to rediscover what is real, not the ideal, not the good, not the obedient, but the true, the wild, the wounded, the sacred. And it is terrifying, because it means dismantling everything built to protect us, the relationships built on performance, the careers that fed our ego but not our spirit, the habits that kept us numb but never full. And yet, this dismantling is necessary, because truth cannot live in a house built on lies, and many people ignore this call. They push it down, they call it depression or boredom or aging, and try to outrun it with distractions, shopping, drinking, new relationships, endless productivity. But the soul is patient, it waits, and eventually it returns, often through dreams, illness, or strange obsessions that make no logical sense, but feel magnetic. And when it does, the choice appears again. Continue the performance or begin the reckoning. And reckoning is not glamorous. It is not a Pinterest board of self-care routines. It is sitting in the dark with the parts of you that were exiled. Your rage, your fear, your lust, your doubt, and saying, I will not banish you anymore. I will listen. I will learn. I will make space for your voice, because healing is not about becoming better. It is about becoming whole. And wholeness includes the mess, the shadow, the contradictions, the parts we were told to hide in order to be loved. But love that requires shrinking is not love. It is a transaction, a bargain, and the self always pays the price. So tonight, sit with this question. What mask have I worn so long I forgot it was a mask? What version of myself have I edited, rehearsed, polished until I could no longer hear my own voice underneath it? And what would happen if I let it slip? Just a little, just enough to feel the air on my skin again. Not to impress, but to exist, to return, to remember. Because underneath all the roles, all the armour, there is still a heartbeat, still a longing, still a soul that remembers who it was before the world told it who to be. And it is not too late to listen. Somewhere in the silence between two thoughts, between the inhale and the exhale, there is a strange realization that most people avoid their entire lives, that everything they think they are is just a story, a fragile narrative stitched together by memory and belief, by feedback and fear, by repetition and roles. And yet this story is treated as sacred, defended as truth, carried like armor into every conversation, every decision, every mirror glance. And it's terrifying to even whisper that it might not be real, not fully, not objectively. Because if the self is a story, then who is telling it? And who are we beneath it? This is the dark doorway that ancient mystics and modern psychologists both point to. The uncomfortable space where identity unravels, where ego loosens, and where what we cling to most, the idea of me, is revealed to be a moving target, a temporary construction built on sand. The philosopher David Hume once wrote that when he looked inward, he found no self, only a bundle of perceptions, thoughts, sensations, flickering constantly, never still, and yet we act as if the self is fixed, solid, a core we must protect, promote, polish. We speak of finding ourselves, of being true to ourselves, but rarely ask what that self even is, or if it exists at all beyond language, beyond habit, beyond the mask we forgot we were wearing. Buddhism speaks of anatta, the doctrine of no self, not to erase identity, but to see through its illusion, to realize that suffering comes not from pain itself, but from clinging to the idea of a permanent self who is being hurt, wronged, diminished, and when that clinging softens, peace enters. Not the peace of winning, but the peace of no longer needing to prove, no longer needing to defend the narrative at all costs, because narratives are fragile and life doesn't care about them. Life interrupts, rewrites, ruins them without warning. And if a person's identity is too tightly bound to the story they tell, they will break with it, shatter when the plot twists, when the roles change, when the mirror reflects something unfamiliar. This is the crisis so many people face without knowing what to call it. The death of a story mistaken for the death of the self. A job lost, a partner leaves, a body changes, and suddenly the narrative collapses. And in its place, panic, grief, confusion, but also a doorway. Because when the story ends, something deeper can begin. Not a better story, not a new mask, but a silence, a stillness, a chance to ask, what remains when there is no story to tell, no image to maintain, no one to impress? This is where the real work begins, the inner excavation. Not to build a better identity, but to see through it altogether, not to become more, but to need less. And this is the philosophy that rattles the modern world, a world obsessed with branding, with being seen, with self-expression as salvation. But if the self is not fixed, then what exactly are we expressing? And why is being seen so important if the one being seen is a fiction, a role, a collage of borrowed traits and survival mechanisms, and yet we cling because to not cling feels like death. And maybe it is a kind of death, the death of ego, of separation, of the myth of control. But what if that death is the beginning of freedom? What if letting go of the story is the way we finally breathe, finally see, not through the eyes of identity, but through the eyes of awareness? Vast, quiet, untroubled, Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, wrote that when everything is taken from a person, what remains is the last human freedom, to choose one's attitude. And that choice does not come from the ego. It comes from something deeper, more resilient, less nameable. And that place, that centerless center, is what lies beneath the story of self. It does not need praise or identity or narrative coherence. It just is. And from that place we act. Not as a performance, but as a presence. We speak not to be liked, but to be true. We move not to validate identity, but to participate in reality. And suddenly the world changes, not because it is different, but because we see without the filter of me, of mine, of what does this say about who I am. And what opens is spaciousness, freedom, not in the way of escape, but in the way of release. So tonight, in the quiet, ask softly, who would I be without my story, without my name, my job, my memories, my opinions? Who or what remains when I stop defending the idea of myself, not as erasure but as curiosity, as an experiment, and feel into that space, not to define it but to dwell in it, because that space is not empty, it is full, not of identity but of life. There is a quiet lie at the heart of modern happiness, a soft illusion sold in bright colours and gentle slogans, that life is supposed to feel good, that fulfillment means ease, that success will bring peace, and that suffering is a glitch, an error, a temporary detour, instead of a fundamental condition of being human. But the truth is stranger, darker, and older than any marketing campaign. Life hurts, and it's supposed to, not because pain is noble, but because pain is honest, and honesty is rare. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that to live is to suffer, to survive is to find meaning in the suffering. But most people skip that second part. They survive by avoiding, by numbing, by silencing the questions that arise in the night, when the noise fades and all that remains is the self, raw, unfinished, trembling. And this is where the real questions live. Not in the bright hours of performance, but in the shadows of collapse, where things break down, where belief fails, where grief tightens its grip and asks, now what? And the answer is not always clear, not always kind. Sometimes there is no answer, just silence, just breath. But even that is something, because to breathe in the dark is still to live, and to live in the dark is still to choose. Viktor Frankl survived the concentration camps, not because he avoided pain, but because he faced it and still chose meaning, and that is the sharp edge of dark philosophy. It doesn't promise joy, it doesn't offer comfort. It whispers, life is hard, but you are not alone in finding it hard, and in that shared struggle, there is a strange beauty, a solidarity, a kind of love. Not the sweet kind, but the strong kind. The kind that holds your hand when the floor falls away and says, I cannot fix this, but I will not leave you. That is what suffering offers, not answers, but presence, a deepening of being, a stripping away of what is false, what is shallow, what is performative. And when the false falls, what remains is truth. And truth is not always kind, but it is always real. And reality is where life begins, not where it ends. So the real question is not how to avoid suffering, but how to suffer well, how to carry pain without becoming it, how to hurt without closing, how to lose without vanishing. And the answer is not simple. It is a daily practice, a choice to stay awake, to feel, to allow, to let the wound breathe, because wounds that are hidden fester, but wounds that are seen can heal, slowly, quietly, imperfectly. And healing doesn't mean erasure, it means integration. It means the pain becomes part of the story, not the whole story. The scar becomes a sentence, not the ending, and slowly, with time, new chapters write themselves. Not happier, but deeper, and depth is its own reward. In the depths we find the self we lost in the noise, the self that isn't defined by success or failure or performance, but by presence, by resilience, by truth, and that self cannot be taken, cannot be bought, cannot be broken, because it was born in the fire. And fire does not destroy everything. It refines, it clarifies, it burns away what is not real, and what remains is simple, still sacred. So tonight, let yourself sit in the dark without rushing to light a candle. Let yourself ache without rushing to soothe it. Let yourself ask without rushing to answer, because some questions are not meant to be solved, they are meant to be lived. And some pain is not meant to be fixed, it is meant to be honoured, to be held, to be witnessed. Not because it's beautiful, but because it's real and reality is rare, and in a world built on distraction, to feel something fully is a radical act. So feel it, fully, quietly, without shame. And know this, if you are suffering, you're not failing. You're not broken, you're simply alive. And to be alive is to be touched by both joy and grief, by both wonder and sorrow, by both light and shadow. And the task is not to escape this, but to embrace it, to let life touch you completely, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts, because in that hurt is a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat is a truth deeper than words. That you are here, that you have survived, and that survival is a kind of wisdom, a kind of grace, a kind of quiet power that does not shout but whispers, I am still here. The earlier tale rests now in stillness, its final words sinking into the quiet like stones, into deep water, leaving only the slow ripples of thought behind. The candle's flame sways gently, and in its light, another journey begins, softer and wider, one that will drift through the great currents of philosophy, touching the ideas that have shaped the minds of centuries. No longer bound to one story, the mind will wander across 10 of the most enduring visions of wisdom, moving slowly so that each thought has time to settle like dust on an untouched shelf. Now let us speak of the first great idea, the Socratic method. It begins not with answers but with questions, small and deliberate, placed like stones on a path to see where they lead. Socrates believed that wisdom does not arrive in the fullness of knowing, but in the humility of realizing how little is truly known. He would meet his students not with lectures, but with simple inquiries, peeling away layers of certainty to reveal the soft, uncertain core beneath. Each answer invited another question, and in this unending dance the mind was forced to see its own contradictions, to stand in the open where assumptions once sheltered it. It is a method that is less about arriving somewhere than about refining the traveller, stripping away false confidence until only the essential remains. In the glow of this idea, one begins to feel the quiet power of conversation, not as a contest to win, but as a shared search where each voice is a lantern and the road ahead is always longer than it seems. Socrates himself left no writings, trusting instead in the living exchange between minds in the way a well-placed question can echo for years inside the heart. Even now, in the silence of this night, his method remains alive. For every honest question asked without the armour of certainty is a small act of Socratic courage, a way of stepping toward truth without claiming to possess it. And perhaps this is why his voice endures, not as the keeper of answers, but as the one who teaches how to walk in their direction. The candle leans, the air shifts, and somewhere in the darkness, the next great idea waits to be called forward. Now let us turn to the next great idea, Plato's theory of forms. Imagine a world beyond sight, untouched by time, where every shape, every truth, every beauty exists in its most perfect state. Plato believed that the reality we see is only a shadow of that higher realm, that the table in front of us is but an echo of the perfect tableness that exists beyond change, beyond decay. In this vision, the physical world is a mirror clouded by imperfection, and what we call knowledge is the act of remembering what the soul has already seen before birth. He spoke of a cave where people sit chained, watching shadows on a wall, believing them to be all there is, until one escapes into the light and sees the forms directly. The journey is not easy. The eyes ache in the brightness. The heart resists the unfamiliar. And yet once truth is glimpsed, the shadows lose their hold. In the forms lies the unchanging essence of things, the perfect circle that no hand can draw, the justice that no law can fully capture, the beauty that no face can forever keep. The senses, Plato warns, can deceive. They show us many chairs, each flawed, yet through thought we can approach the single, flawless form of chairness that makes them all possible. And so the philosopher's work is to look beyond appearances, to use reason as a bridge to that higher reality, to anchor the soul in what cannot fade. It is a comforting thought that somewhere there is a place where nothing breaks, nothing dies, nothing loses its shape, that all goodness and truth are preserved whole. But it is also a demanding thought, for it asks the mind to see the world not as an end, but as a clue, a path, a whisper of something greater. In this way, every ordinary thing becomes a signpost, every imperfect moment a reminder that perfection exists elsewhere, drawing us on. And perhaps in quiet moments like this, we can almost sense it, not with the eyes, but with the still part of the soul that recognizes what it once knew. The candle burns steadily, casting its own shadows on the wall, and one wonders which world this light belongs to, the one of change or the one of forms. Perhaps both. Perhaps every flicker is an invitation to turn toward the light. Now let us speak of Aristotle's virtue ethics, a vision of the good life not built on rigid rules or fleeting pleasures, but on the cultivation of character. Aristotle saw human life as a movement toward eudaimonia, a word often softened into happiness, but more deeply meaning human flourishing, the full flowering of one's nature. This is not a state one stumbles into by fortune, but a way of living shaped by countless choices, each one forming the habits that become the soul's architecture. Virtue, to Aristotle, is the balance between extremes, the golden mean between excess and deficiency. Courage lies between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity lies between wastefulness and stinginess. Honesty lies between boastfulness and self-deprecation. These are not mathematical midpoints, but living balances, different for each person, found through experience, reflection, and the slow refining of judgment. One becomes virtuous as one learns to play an instrument, not by reading notes alone, but by practice, by the feel of the strings, by mistakes that teach the hand where to rest. It is a philosophy that respects action, for knowing the good is not enough if one does not also do the good. And yet action must be guided by reason, for virtue is no accident. It is a harmony between thought and deed, where impulse is tempered by wisdom. In Aristotle's view, the virtuous person does the right thing not through struggle, but with a kind of ease as a skilled craftsman moves through his work with steady hands. Such ease is not born of laziness, but of long effort made natural. The world in this light is not a place to endure until some better life begins, but the very field in which the soul's excellence is cultivated. Every encounter, every challenge, every moment of choice is an opportunity to strengthen the fibre of one's being. And so, the good life is not defined by wealth, power, or comfort, but by the steady accumulation of virtues, until the self stands as a well-built structure, able to weather the winds of fortune without collapse. In this way, happiness is not a prize, but the natural radiance of a well-shaped soul, a light that does not flicker with the passing of days. The candle's flame bends slightly in a whisper of unseen air, and one is reminded that balance, like virtue, is not stillness, but a constant adjustment, a living alignment with the good. Now let us turn to the thought of Descartes and the words that have echoed through centuries. Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. It is a phrase born not from pride, but from doubt so deep it sought to strip away everything that could possibly be questioned, leaving only what could not be denied. Descartes imagined himself sweeping the mind clean of all assumption, pulling away the familiar scaffolding of belief until he stood alone in a vast space where nothing felt certain. Could the senses be trusted? They had deceived before. Could memories be trusted? They could be illusions. Could the body itself be trusted? Perhaps it was a dream, a trick, a fleeting projection. And yet, in the very act of doubting, one thing stood firm. There must be something that doubts. Thought itself became the bedrock, the one point that could not be faked or stolen. If thinking was happening, then something existed to do the thinking. This was not the end of his journey, but the first firm stone on which to build. From here, Descartes sought to rebuild the house of knowledge, brick by brick, each step tested for certainty. He wished for clarity, as bright as geometry, truths so undeniable they could support all others. His method was deliberate, patient, as if sharpening a blade to cut away falsehood. And yet, there is something quietly human in the idea that the first certainty we can hold is the awareness of our own awareness, the strange fact that consciousness can turn inward and see itself. In the stillness of night, this feels less like a cold proof and more like a small ember glowing in the dark, a reminder that no matter how uncertain the world becomes, the flame of thought still burns. It is a solitary comfort, one that exists even when stripped of names, possessions, histories, even when all that remains is the bare knowing that we are here, now, thinking. Descartes' thought also whispers of the responsibility that comes with such certainty. If the self is known before all else, then it becomes the lens through which the world is built. A clear mind builds a clear life. A mind clouded with haste or fear builds a world that feels the same. To begin with, I think, is also to admit that the quality of thought matters, that the architecture of our inner world shapes the outer. The candle beside him might flicker, casting shifting shadows, but the fact of its light is undeniable. So too is the mind. Shadows may move across it, illusions may play on its surface, but the fact of its shining cannot be erased. In this way, cogito, ergo sum, is not a shout of triumph, but a steady breath in the silence, the quiet voice that remains when all other voices have been questioned away. It is the ground beneath the feet when the fog hides everything else, the one certainty from which all other certainties might grow. And perhaps, in the hours before sleep, when the body lies still and thought drifts, it is enough to hold this single truth without reaching for more, that in the act of thinking, of doubting, of wondering, there is existence, and in that existence, there is the beginning of all understanding. Now let us move to Kant's categorical imperative, a moral compass not drawn from desire or consequence, but from duty itself, pure and unbending. Kant asked what it would mean to act in such a way that one's choices could be made into universal law, binding for all in all places, at all times. He sought a morality that stood above preference, stronger than impulse, untouched by the shifting tides of personal gain. Imagine pausing before each act to ask, if everyone did this, could the world still stand? If the answer is no, the act must be set aside, however tempting, however small. This is the first face of the imperative, a rule that turns the mirror outward to humanity as a whole, asking the self to see its choices not as private shadows, but as patterns in a greater weave. The second face is equally stern, yet equally luminous. Treat every person as an end in themselves, never merely as a means. In this, Kant draws a line against using others as tools for one's own purposes, however noble the excuse. Each person is a whole world, not a rung on a ladder, and to honour that is to honour the dignity of reason itself. The beauty of this thought lies in its symmetry, one's own freedom bound only by the freedom of all others, the moral law arising not from command, but from the structure of thought that all rational beings share. In Kant's view, morality is not a gift from heaven nor a contract with society, but something woven into the very capacity to reason, a truth that would shine even in a universe empty of gods. And yet, he admits, to follow it is no easy task. Desire pulls like wind, fear presses like weight, and the clarity of the imperative can feel cold against the warmth of inclination. But for Kant, it is in that cold clarity that moral worth is found. For to act rightly when it costs nothing is no great proof of virtue, but to act rightly against one's own advantage is the mark of a will aligned with the moral law. There is a certain quiet majesty in this view, the thought that even in the smallest decision one participates in a law as vast and impartial as the night sky, each act a star in a constellation too large for one life to see whole. The candle on the desk leans lower, its flame steady despite the draught, and one is reminded that light does not ask whether it is convenient to shine, it simply fulfills its nature. In this, Kant's imperative finds its living image, a steady flame guided not by whim or reward, but by the form of its own being. Now let us drift into Nietzsche's vision of the will to power, a force he saw not as the hunger for mere control over others, but as the deep, restless impulse within all living things to grow, to expand, to overcome the boundaries of what they are. For Nietzsche, life itself was a movement toward more life, a ceaseless reaching, like roots pressing through stone or rivers carving valleys over centuries. The will to power was not simply ambition, nor the shallow thirst for domination, but the inner current that drives the seed to become a tree, the artist to create beyond exhaustion, the thinker to break the limits of inherited truth. In his eyes, existence was not content to remain still. It surged forward in infinite forms, testing itself, reshaping itself, becoming more than it was. Even suffering could be part of this will, for struggle was not a mark of weakness, but a forge where strength was tempered. To embrace the will to power was to see life not as a series of obstacles, to endure until rest, but as a great arena in which one's being was sharpened through challenge, conflict, and creation. He warned against the life lived too safely, for in the shelter from hardship, the will could wither, becoming timid and pale. Better, he thought, to step into the storm and find in it the raw material from which to build oneself anew. It was this idea that fed his vision of the Übermensch, the one who creates their own values, standing beyond the dictates of the herd, shaping a self as an artist shapes stone, not with submission, but with the courage to carve. Such a life was not without cost. It demanded the abandonment of illusions that comfort but weaken, the acceptance that meaning is not given but made. Yet in this creation, the will to power finds its highest form, not in ruling over others, but in ruling over the self, in mastering the chaos within and turning it toward a work of art that is one's own existence. The night deepens as the thought settles, and one can feel in its quiet insistence the truth Nietzsche sensed, that even in stillness, the will stirs like embers beneath ash, waiting for the breath that will bring them back into flame. Now let us turn to the idea of utilitarianism, the quiet yet weighty belief that the right action is the one that brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number. It is a thought that moves like a measuring hand over every choice, weighing pleasure against pain, joy against sorrow, as if morality itself could be shaped into a delicate balance. Jeremy Bentham spoke of it first in clear, almost mathematical terms, imagining each decision as a calculation, a sum of benefit and harm. John Stuart Mill refined it, reminding that not all pleasures are equal, that the delight of the mind and the depth of the heart stand above the fleeting gratifications of the body. In this way, the principle grows from mere arithmetic into a philosophy of care, one that asks not simply, "What do I want?" but "What will ease the burdens of all?" And yet, there is a softness in its ambition, for it does not dream of perfect worlds or flawless virtue, only of the steady increase of well-being, the lessening of needless suffering. In the quiet of night, such a thought has a certain tenderness, a recognition that life is already heavy and that the best we can do is to make it lighter where we can. But utilitarianism is not without its shadows. To weigh happiness is to sometimes choose between lives, to accept that what benefits the many may wound the few, and this calculation can cut deeply into the fabric of moral certainty. It demands a coolness of mind that can seem at odds with the warmth of compassion, and yet it is driven by compassion's root desire, that pain be less and joy be more. One might picture it as a lantern carried through a dark field, its light cast not just for the carrier, but for all who walk nearby. Each act becomes a ripple in a still pond, spreading outward in rings unseen, touching lives never met. To live by such a rule is to be always aware of these ripples, to choose with an eye not on the self alone, but on the widening circle of effect. In this way, the smallest kindness becomes great, and the smallest cruelty becomes grave. The candle's flame dips, sways, then steadies again, and one can almost feel in that fragile steadiness the essence of this thought, that the good is not a single blaze, but the gentle work of keeping the light burning for as many as it can reach. Now let us drift into the realm of existentialism, a philosophy that stands in the quiet space between the vast indifference of the universe and the fragile beating of a human heart. Kierkegaard spoke of the leap, the choice to believe or to act in the face of uncertainty, while Sartre declared that existence precedes essence, that we are not born with a fixed nature, but must carve our own from the raw stone of being. In this vision, there is no script, no eternal blueprint waiting to be discovered, only the open field of freedom, both exhilarating and heavy with the weight of responsibility. For to be free is also to be without excuse. Every choice, even the refusal to choose, shapes the meaning of one's life. Camus saw this clearly in the figure of Sisyphus, condemned to push the boulder without end, yet free to find joy in the act itself, to turn the burden into a form of defiance. In existentialism, the meaning of life is not given but made, shaped moment by moment in the furnace of decision. It is a philosophy that does not shy from the darkness. It asks us to stand within it and light our own small flame, knowing it may be the only one. This freedom can be dizzying, for the mind longs for certainty, for a map, for a guiding star that will not fade. Yet existentialism whispers that no such star is fixed, that we must chart the heavens ourselves, and that in doing so we become the cartographers of our own reality. Even despair in this light can be transformed, for when nothing is predetermined, every step becomes a declaration, every act a creation. The candle on the table burns without asking why. Its purpose is found in the burning itself. So too with life. Its meaning may be nothing more than the living of it, and yet in that simple truth lies a strange and unshakable dignity. To live without guarantees is to walk a path that is fully one's own, and in that ownership there is both solitude and strength. Perhaps this is why, in the quiet hours, existentialism feels less like a burden and more like a permission, the permission to be, to choose, to shape, and to stand as the sole author of one's fleeting but luminous story. Now let us move into the idea of the social contract, the quiet yet binding thread that weaves individuals into the fabric of a society. Hobbes spoke of a world before such a contract, a state of nature where life, though free, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, where each lived by strength or cunning, and safety was a fragile dream. To escape this chaos, people, he said, surrendered certain freedoms, placing them in the hands of a sovereign power in exchange for order and protection. Locke's vision was gentler, imagining the contract as a guardian of life, liberty, and property, with the right to replace rulers who broke its trust. Rousseau heard another note entirely, speaking of the general will, the shared interest that rises above individual desires, the possibility of a collective self that acts not to oppress but to free. In each telling, the contract is not a paper in a drawer, but a living agreement, renewed in every act of cooperation, every law obeyed or challenged, every moment where self-interest bends toward the common good. It is unseen yet everywhere, shaping the streets we walk, the words we speak, the trust with which we open our doors at night. Without it, the world would return to the scattered silence of fear, where each step must be guarded and every stranger is a threat. Yet with it comes the weight of obligation, for to be part of a society is to bear the responsibility of maintaining its justice, to give as well as to take, to remember that rights are not solitary possessions, but shared inheritances. The candle burns lower, its light touching the edges of the room, and one feels in that circle the shape of the contract itself, an agreement to keep the flame alive so that all may see. But contracts, like flames, are delicate. They require care, they demand the tending of truth, the protection of fairness, the vigilance against those who would twist the common good to private ends. And so, to honour the social contract is not only to live within its safety, but to guard its spirit, to ensure that the promise made long ago in silence still holds in the lives of those who have never spoken it aloud. Now let us wander into the ancient current of the Tao, the way, the quiet path spoken of in the old verses of Lao Tzu, a path not built but discovered, not forced but followed. The Tao is the rhythm beneath all rhythms, the flowing order that needs no command, the movement of clouds and rivers, the unfurling of leaves, the turning of the seasons, all in harmony, without hurry. To walk with the Tao is to let go of the restless urge to control, to see that the world shapes itself without the heavy hand of constant interference. The sages called this Wu Wei, effortless action. Not idleness, but the art of doing in a way that does not fight the current. It is the tree bending in the wind rather than breaking, the stream finding its way, a round stone without force. The Tao is not a destination, but the living present. Not a doctrine, but the quiet awareness that each moment holds its own completeness. It asks no oaths, no declarations, only the soft attentiveness that notices the pattern already unfolding. One who follows the Tao is like water, yielding yet unstoppable, clear yet deep, seeking the low places others avoid, nourishing without demanding. This way of being does not deny desire, but it does not cling to it. It does not refuse action, but it does not wrestle with it. In this light, ambition is not abandoned, but transformed, becoming less about climbing and more about flowing, less about conquest and more about harmony. The candle flickers with a small shift in the air, its flame swaying but not going out. A small lesson in the Tao itself, movement without loss, change without destruction. To understand the Tao is to see that control is an illusion, that the greatest strength often lies in yielding, that the world's deepest wisdom moves quietly, without announcement, shaping mountains and lives alike in its patient course. And so the way is always here, as near as the breath, as silent as the stars, waiting only for the stillness in which it can be heard. Now let us drift into David Hume's quiet yet unsettling thought, the problem of induction, a gentle unthreading of the trust we place in the patterns of the world. From childhood, we are taught to expect that the sun will rise tomorrow because it rose today, that bread will nourish because it always has, that dropped stones will fall because they always do. But Hume asked, How can we truly know this? We have seen these patterns repeat, yes, but repetition is not proof. We believe the future will mirror the past, not because of reason, but because of habit. A habit so deep it feels like certainty. We watch cause and effect as though they are bound together by necessity, yet what we actually see is only one thing following another, again and again, until the mind weaves its own invisible thread between them. We never witness the binding itself, only the sequence, only the rhythm. In this way, our confidence in tomorrow rests on an assumption we cannot prove, and yet cannot live without. Hume did not mean to strip the world of trust, but to show that our trust is a creature of the mind, not the logic of the universe. This thought can feel like standing at the edge of a vast plain at night, knowing the path forward is only lit by the small lantern of memory, and the rest is darkness we simply step into, believing the ground will still be there. The beauty of Hume's insight lies in its humility, for it reminds us that knowledge is not as solid as we wish it to be, that certainty is a quiet agreement between experience and expectation. Even the candle beside us burns with the same illusion. We expect it will keep burning in the next moment, but this is only because it has burned in the last. Perhaps it will, perhaps it won't, but our life moves forward as though it must. In this space between proof and habit, between knowledge and trust, Hume leaves us not with despair, but with the awareness that the mind's faith in the future is one of its most fragile and necessary acts. Now let us wander into the old and tempting vision of hedonism, the belief that pleasure is the highest good, that the measure of a life is found in the fullness of its delights. To the ancient Greeks, it was not a call to endless indulgence, but a search for the truest forms of happiness, the kind that endure rather than vanish in the aftertaste of excess. Epicurus spoke of it as the art of seeking pleasure wisely, of choosing those joys that do not bring pain in their shadow, of cultivating the simple satisfactions that need no wealth or conquest to sustain them. For him, bread and water could be a feast if taken with peace of mind, and friendship, quiet and deep, was a treasure greater than gold. In this light, pleasure was not the frantic grasping at sensation, but the gentle shaping of life, to avoid unnecessary suffering, to find contentment in what is near at hand. Yet hedonism holds a mirror to a truth many resist. That pain is the weight we seek to set down, and joy is the lightness we seek to carry. To follow this path is to learn the difference between what pleases in the moment and what nourishes across time, to see that the richest pleasures are often the softest ones, like the warmth of the sun on closed eyelids or the sound of rain against a window. But there is danger here too, for the pursuit of pleasure can so easily drift into a hunger that is never sated, a chasing of peaks that leaves one hollow between them. This is why the wiser hedonists speak of balance, of knowing when to stop, of savouring rather than consuming. The candle burns with a steady glow, giving its light freely but within the limits of its wax. It does not seek to burn faster, for that would be to end itself. So too with pleasure, when it is taken in measure, it sustains; when taken in greed, it destroys. Hedonism, at its truest, is the art of knowing the difference. Now let us move into the deep and endless question of determinism and free will, the tension between the chains of cause and the dream of choice. Determinism whispers that every action, every thought, every breath is the inevitable result of all that came before, that the universe is a vast, unbroken chain stretching backward to the first movement and forward to the last, each link forged by the one before it. In this view, the moment of decision is not a birth but an unfolding, like a seed opening because it must, like the tide rising because it is pulled. If the mind is shaped by genes, by upbringing, by the precise arrangement of atoms and events, then perhaps even the belief in freedom is simply another link in the chain. And yet, against this, the feeling of choice rises like a stubborn flame, the sense of standing at a crossroads, of being able to step left or right, to speak or remain silent, to act or to refrain. Free will insists that within the machinery there is a space, however small, where the self can push against the weight of what has been and make something new. Some see the two not as enemies but as different lights on the same river, that perhaps the current is fixed, yet the way one moves within it is one's own, that freedom may lie not in altering the flow, but in choosing how to meet it. Others suggest that even if all is determined, the experience of choosing is real enough to live by, for a life lived as if one is free is shaped differently than one lived in resignation. The candle on the table burns because the match was struck. The match was struck because the hand moved. The hand moved because of thoughts. The thoughts arose because of other moments, each leading to this small circle of light. Whether this flame was inevitable from the birth of the stars or lit by a free and sudden act may never be known. Perhaps it is in the mystery between these two that human life unfolds, a dance of necessity and possibility, where even if the steps are written, the dancer still moves with grace. Now let us step into the quiet puzzle of the ship of Theseus, an ancient question that drifts between the harbours of identity and change. The story is simple. A ship preserved in honour of a hero is kept seaworthy for centuries by replacing its parts as they decay. First a plank, then a mast, then the sails, until every single piece is new. And so the question arises, when all the original parts are gone, is it still the same ship? At first it feels like a trick of language, but the longer one lingers, the deeper it pulls. For if the ship is not the same, then at what moment did it cease to be itself? Was it when the first plank was replaced, or the last? And if it is the same, then what makes it so? The form, the function, the name, or something else entirely? The puzzle grows stranger still when one imagines the discarded pieces gathered and rebuilt into a ship identical to the original. Which then is the true ship of Theseus, the one with the unbroken history, or the one made of the original wood? The candle flame quivers slightly, and one realizes that the question is not only about ships but about people, for our bodies too are replaced piece by piece as the years turn, cells dying and being born, memories fading and shifting, beliefs evolving, faces changing. Yet we say without hesitation, I am still myself. Perhaps identity is not the matter from which we are made, but the continuity of the journey, the thread of experience and memory woven through time. Or perhaps we are, like the ship, something that both changes completely and remains somehow whole, our essence not fixed but a living thing, shaped and reshaped by the tides of existence. In this way, the ship of Theseus is less a riddle to be solved than a mirror, quietly reflecting the mystery of what it means to remain oneself while becoming someone new. Now let us rest within the strange and quiet terrain of absurdism, the recognition, as Albert Camus saw it, that human beings are creatures who seek meaning in a universe that offers none in return. The mind yearns for clarity, for a grand design, for a purpose written in the stars, yet when it looks outward, it meets only silence, a vast and unbroken stillness. This is the absurd, not chaos, not hostility, but the endless tension between the hunger for meaning and the absence of it. Many, upon feeling this weight, rush to escape it, turning to faith, ideology, or distraction, anything to stitch a pattern into the blank cloth of existence. But Camus suggested another way, to face the absurd without flinching, to accept that life is without ultimate explanation, and yet to live it fully, intensely, as though the lack of meaning were not a prison, but a kind of freedom. In his image of Sisyphus pushing the stone, he saw not a figure crushed by futility, but one who, in embracing the endless task, finds his own victory. If there is no higher plan, then each moment becomes the canvas, and we, the painters of its fleeting colours. The candle's flame, which will inevitably burn down to nothing, still gives its light in this moment, and that light is enough. Absurdism asks not for resignation, but for defiance, not the bitter defiance of rage, but the quiet defiance of joy, the choice to smile in the face of the void. It whispers that life's worth is not hidden behind some distant curtain to be drawn back at the end, but here, in the very act of living, in the taste of water, in the warmth of a shared glance, in the sound of wind moving through leaves at night. And so, one learns to walk through the silence with open eyes, to push the stone with steady hands, knowing that the meaning one seeks may never come, and yet finding, in the seeking itself, something that feels like meaning after all. Now let us enter the shadowed depths of Plato's allegory of the cave, a vision of human understanding drawn in the soft charcoal of myth. Imagine a group of people who have lived their whole lives chained in darkness, their faces turned toward a wall, able to see only the flickering shadows cast by objects passing before a fire behind them. To these prisoners, the shadows are the only reality, the shapes the only truth, for they have never seen the objects themselves, nor the fire, nor the world beyond the cave. Then imagine that one prisoner is freed, pulled into the light, stumbling and blinded at first. For the truth is painful when the eyes have known only darkness. Slowly, shapes emerge, the fire, the path upward, and finally, beyond the cave, the vast and radiant world under the open sky. Trees, water, sunlight, stars. In that moment, the freed one understands that all they had believed was but a pale reflection of something greater. Yet the allegory does not end there, for the freed prisoner feels the pull to return, to descend again into the cave and tell the others of what lies beyond. But the others, unaccustomed to such talk, may not believe, may even resist, for the comfort of familiar shadows can feel safer than the blinding strangeness of truth. Plato's vision is not only about knowledge, but about the soul's journey from illusion to reality and the cost of awakening. For to see the light is also to know the darkness for what it is, and to live with the burden of both. The candle on the table flickers, casting soft shadows on the wall, and one can feel the cave in them, the way perception can be bound by what the senses allow, the way truth often waits beyond the frame of sight. The allegory whispers that each life is a kind of cave, and that to seek wisdom is to climb toward the light, even if the ascent is slow, even if the sun's brightness brings tears, even if the ones left below cannot follow. Now let us move into the still centre of Aristotle's golden mean, the gentle balance he saw as the heart of virtue, the narrow path between the cliffs of excess and deficiency. For Aristotle, every virtue is a midpoint, not an exact line drawn in stone, but a living balance that shifts with circumstance and person. Courage lies between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between miserliness and waste, humility between arrogance and self-abasement. It is not the avoidance of extremes for their own sake, but the seeking of the place where equality is at its most fitting, most human, most whole. This balance is not static, for life moves, and with it the measure of the mean. What is courage in one moment may be recklessness in another. What is restraint today may be cowardice tomorrow. The golden mean asks for a constant listening, a steady attunement to the harmony of the situation, as a musician adjusts each note to the flow of the music. In this way, virtue becomes less a rigid rule and more a craft, something shaped with patience and care, a skill honed in the quiet decisions that fill the days. Yet to live in balance is not to live without passion. Aristotle did not call for the dull flattening of all feeling, but for the full flowering of what is good in its right place and measure. The candle burns at such a mean. Too small a flame, and it will fade into darkness. Too large, and it will consume itself. But here it glows steadily, giving light and warmth without waste. The golden mean is a reminder that wisdom often lives, not in the loud gesture or the final extreme, but in the quiet middle, where the forces of life meet and steady each other. And so, to walk in virtue is to walk that narrow yet shifting road, feeling the weight of each step, listening for the place where one stands in harmony with both the self and the world. Now let us drift into the quiet logic of the principle of sufficient reason, the thought that nothing exists without a reason why it is so and not otherwise. Leibniz shaped it into a guiding light for the mind, a soft but unyielding demand that every fact, every event, every shadow and star carries within it the thread of its own explanation. To accept this principle is to believe that the world is not scattered chaos, but an ordered tapestry, each stitch bound to the next by the necessity, of course, the inevitability of reason. Yet this is not only a law for the scientist or the philosopher, it is the silent pull that makes a child ask why again and again, the impulse to peer behind the curtain of the obvious, to lift the stone and see what lives beneath. It whispers that no leaf falls without a cause, no thought rises in the mind without its roots, no flame burns without the marriage of air and spark. The candle before us is here because the wax was shaped, the wick was set, the match was struck. The air allowed it to live, each step a reason, each reason part of a longer chain that winds back beyond sight. But the principle carries its own shadows, for if everything must have a reason, then what reason is there for the whole of existence itself? What stands at the end of the chain, giving reason to all, yet needing none? Leibniz answered with the idea of a necessary being, something whose reason for existing lies in its own nature, something that simply is. Others see in this the limits of reason itself, a place where the mind meets the horizon and can go no further. Still, the principle remains a lantern in the dark, guiding thought through the tangled forest of causes, reminding us that to understand is to search for the thread that binds each moment to another, even if in the end that thread disappears into the silence from which all things come. Now let us sink into the shadowed waters of nihilism, the unsettling recognition that life may hold no inherent meaning, no ultimate purpose written into its fabric. The word carries the chill of emptiness, yet its roots lie not in the desire to destroy, but in the willingness to strip away illusions, to stand before the world without the shelter of comforting fictions. Nietzsche spoke of it as both a danger and a beginning. For when the old beliefs crumble, when the foundations that once seemed eternal turn to dust, a vast space opens. Some see in that space only despair, a void into which all values collapse, a darkness in which the self drifts without anchor. Yet others find in it a strange liberation, the freedom to shape meaning rather than receive it, to become the author rather than the subject of life's story. Nihilism does not erase the sun or silence the wind. It changes only the frame in which they're seen. The candle's flame still burns, though it owes its light to nothing beyond itself. And in that self-contained glow, there is a quiet beauty. To live without inherent meaning is not to live without value. It is to understand that value is made, not found, woven from choice, from love, from the small acts of creation that give colour to the days. The danger comes when the void is mistaken for an end rather than a beginning, when the absence of given purpose is read as the absence of all purpose. But for those who can bear the weight of it, nihilism becomes not a sentence, but a horizon, a wide and open space where the individual stands in the stillness and begins to speak meaning into the silence. It is a call to live, not because life is guaranteed to matter, but because it can be made to matter. And in that making lies a kind of quiet triumph. Now let us step into the looping corridor of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, the thought experiment that bends time into a circle and asks the soul to dwell within it. Imagine that one night, in the stillness of solitude, a voice comes to whisper that every moment of life, every breath, every joy and sorrow will return to you again and again, not once, not twice, but endlessly, exactly as it has unfolded before. Each gesture repeated, each word spoken again, each glance, each mistake, each triumph, forever. At first, the thought may feel like a weight, an unbearable burden, the idea that even the smallest pains will be lived not only once but countless times. Yet Nietzsche posed it not as a curse but as a test, a mirror held to the heart to ask, if this were true, could one embrace it? Could one say yes to the totality of existence, to the light and the shadow, the sweetness and the bitterness, as if they were inseparable notes in the same music? To live as though the eternal recurrence were real is to live without reservation, to choose each act as if it were to echo across eternity, to stand before life and affirm it wholly without wishing a single moment away. The candle before us burns with the same silent repetition. Each flicker is both new and the same, a dance of light that will appear and vanish in countless forms, yet always aflame. The idea does not demand belief in a literal cycle. It asks instead whether one can meet life with such depth of acceptance that even if all returned forever, nothing in it would be denied. It is a call to live so completely that time itself, in its endless turning, would become not a prison, but a celebration, a circle one would step into again and again, not in resignation, but in joy.